the second lecture we're going to be focused, yesterday we focused on hunting adaptation, and today we're going to be looking at how things avoid being eaten. So predator avoidance adaptations. And a few of these things sort of link in with the last lecture, things like camouflage and crypsis, but there are a few things that are very specific to avoiding predation. So through this talk, we're going to go through 4 main avoidance methods, which are listed here, each of which has an advantage and some disadvantages, but all the way up to probably the smoking gun for avoidance, which is the best at the end with this one that we're going to talk about. So starting at the easiest and the most broadly used avoidance methods, hide and seek. So animals can hide in a variety of places on the coral reefs, and it's something that a lot of organisms use to avoid being predated. But it does come with a lot of drawbacks. Hiding, especially if you're a small organism like this little goby, you're scared to go outside because you're always at risk of being eaten, so you stay in your little hole, and it basically means you have less time for foraging and mate acquisition and the things that you need to do in your life, or the fish needs to do in its life to get by. So hiding can actually have a lot of drawbacks, even though it's very, very easy for everyone to do. Camouflage, or crypsis as it's known, this is something that has evolved, it's a more highly evolved and commonly used in the reefs as well. We went over it yesterday in the predation methods. A lot of animals will use crypsis and camouflage and background matching to actually hunt their prey, but it's also used to avoid being eaten. The advantage of camouflage is that it basically allows you to move around slightly more freely, in that if you are in an environment with a lot of sponge, you can move a few meters here and there without being spotted. It also helps in the sort of predator-prey relationship if you are a fish in the middle of the food chain, in that you can avoid being eaten, but you can also use your feeding tactics to catch prey. Things like the frogfish, which uses this ambush predatory method, as well as the things like the grouper. But as we know from yesterday, camouflage comes with these drawbacks in that it's very, very specific to the environment in which they are living, and they have evolved to match. Weapons have evolved in a large, broad variety of species, and they're really, really good because they don't need to blend into their background. They're able to move wherever they want and carry their defense on their back. They can go everywhere to forage, to mate, whatever it is. And we saw a lot of the pufferfish, which is yesterday on Hindang, which is a great example of weaponry. But weapons are really, really costly to produce and really, really energy costly to carry as well. They're bulky. You're not as streamlined when you're carrying around a big spike or a massive claw. So they come with a drawback. And then colours and patterns, warning colours, is probably the most commonly used adaptation for predator avoidance on the reef, and it's something that is, the reason for this is really, really good. It has very limited or very few drawbacks. You can move freely in the environment without being eaten. You're advertising the risk of someone eating you. You know, I'm bright and scary, don't eat me, it won't taste good. And it doesn't really use any energy to move around with this, or to create the toxins in their body. So we're going to go through a few examples of these in each sort of category and talk a little bit more in detail. So obviously predator avoidance is reducing the likelihood of being eaten. As I've said, there's all of the different types of methods, but there are slight variations within each of these, which can be used by different species. So things like schooling, like big groups of fish, that can also be used as a predation method, although we won't go into too much detail on that. But we've seen some great examples even today of the jackfish and things schooling together. Nocturnal behaviours as well, so diurnal, nocturnal, diurnal being daytime, and nocturnal fish. They are obviously slightly better or slightly less likely to be eaten because there's less going on the reef, it's darker. However, there are certain predators that have evolved great vision to be able to take advantage of this. Something as well is a sort of quite unique avoidance method is staying near large predators. So it's this like risk-free reward, but it can be really, really worthwhile. So if we see a massive sort of tiger shark or something like that, then we might see things like remoras or smaller trevally actually behind it. And this is basically just using the tiger shark as its human shield, fish shield. Less likely to be predated on because you've got this massive apex predatory fish protecting you. It's like a bodyguard. So here we have an example of 3 very different species of organisms that we might see on dives. But on the left, we have the example of the organism very, very early in its life, so either larval or post-larval. And these are things that you can see, and in fact was seen today already on in the daytime, this post-larval flounder. I think Mint and James saw this. It's a great example of how organisms will adapt their morphology, their body type, and their predator avoidance methods in their early life compared to their later life, because the environment that they're inhabiting is very different. So if we look at the, let's use the juvenile or larval oarfish. Oarfish are a very, very deep living fish species, the largest bony fish in the sea, very, very rarely seen. But the larval oarfish is sort of in with the zooplankton that comes up at the night time that we can see on our blackwater dives. Here, it's very, very small, very vulnerable to predation. So it has lots of these tentacles and sort of spines, which are there's 2 ways. Number one, it's not going to be very comfortable for the fish to be eating that. They are actually weapons. But also, they are using or taking advantage of mimicry. So these tentacles are advertising, don't eat me. The crab, obviously, as an adult, has 2 claws, famous crabs have claws. But as a juvenile, it's very, very different. It's not living on the substrate or on the sand or on the coral reef, walking around on legs. It's actually larval just swimming through, free floating in the current. And because of this, it doesn't have claws, but it has developed these very long and dangerous looking spines to avoid being eaten. Later in life, these traits will develop into what we know a lot of these adult organisms have, such as the crypsis with the flounder living beneath the sand, and the crabs having claws. But they look very, very different in their early life towards their late life. Some other great examples of things we might see on blackwater dives. Some examples of tentacles, weaponry, and spines. So this is a juvenile or larval lionfish, and you can see that it doesn't quite have as large of the dorsal fin spines, but it has got this really extravagant sort of mane, lion's mane almost, that is very, very unappealing to potential predators. They don't want to eat this, it's going to be really uncomfortable, and these act as weapons. Same goes for the juvenile spiralfish, or larval spiralfish with this sort of sword-like appendage coming off of its mouth. And then again, another example of the larval oarfish with these mimicking tentacles, very much mimicking things like jellyfish, which do often inhabit the same environment as these oarfish.
Is the lionfish poisonous when it's small?
It will probably still have venom, yeah, but these are tiny, so things that are eating it are going to be a lot larger and probably quite immune to the amount of toxins that's going to have. These are very, very micro. So instead, it uses these large appendages to make itself look bigger and scarier and less appealing. Talking about mimicry, there are many other species that can do this. And especially again in the blackwater, it's a great example of how often this occurs. So here we have a juvenile or post-larval threadfin trevally, also known I think as an African Arno in some places. And this is something that, hence the name threadfin, has these very, very long dorsal and anal fins, which trail off very, very far. In the black water, when there's no other senses around, then predators are really going to believe that this might be a jellyfish. It really highly resembles the tentacles on something like a box jellyfish that most things do not want to eat, and we don't want to touch either. So it's a really great example of this biomimicry that we were kind of touching on yesterday with the anglerfish. This can also be used for predator defense, and it's actually a really, really effective method to avoid being predated. So, apart from hiding, being the most universal, we all know what hiding is, we can move on to camouflage and crypsis. So, here you can see 4 examples of some very, very well camouflaged frogfish. The clown or pink fin frogfish on the left here is something that is very, very small, and it's evolved to background match the sponge that it lives on. Sometimes the barrel sponge, but often this very, very pink sponge, which we can see all over the dives across the sites that we're on. The same as this yellow sponge here, we can see that quite often on the dive sites. So there are definitely places to be looking out for these very, very small frogfish, although you're going to have to be really eagle-eyed because they are very, very well matched to their background, even to the point where they start growing moss and sediment to actually mask their body shape. They also have done a really, really good job of mimicking the texture of the sponge. So you can see that their skin is very much like the undulations you see in the sponge, and even things like their eyes and these spots around are actually made to mimic the pores or the holes that we see in the sponges. So really, really great job at mimicking their environment. As we know though, these are very, very specific adaptations. If this frogfish moves from that sponge or that particular environment, it's a very, very big risk of being predated. So this is obviously a drawback of camouflage and crypsis. This frogfish on the right, just as a little caveat, this is the sargassum frogfish, and it lives at the surface. It's evolved to live in the sargassum seaweed, and it's really, really good at matching this. And it's something that, especially on the other side of Thailand, I'm not sure about here, but people spend years and years and years trying to find this. Something actually that I guess it's quite lucky, but they have adapted now to not necessarily need sargassum, but instead they have adapted to be living and thriving within large ghost fishing nets that are actually floating on the surface, because it really, really resembles that floatum, as it's called, the material on the surface. And actually, removing one fishing net, I've found about 30 or 40 of these. So it's definitely something to look for if you're ever doing some conservation activity like that. But it also then is a great example of when we remove these from the fishing net and we go to release them, they stick out like a sore thumb. So this adaptation is very, very specific to the environment that they're living in. So next we have weapons. Spines, tentacles, claws can all be really, really effective weapons. But as we know, and as I said, they are extremely bulky and heavy to carry, and also really require a large amount of energy to actually develop these throughout their life. If they don't have the amount of nutrients and food available to them, then they might not be developing these weapons effectively enough to actually be used as predator defense. So yeah, the giant pufferfish, porcupine fish, masked porcupine fish, seal pufferfish that we saw yesterday, these are all fantastic examples of weapons being used in the environment. Some of these have combined the use of spines with also toxins, and also combine this with things like the coloration, warning coloration to give people, don't come near me, which we'll come on to in a minute. So, as well as having these weapons for predator defense that are purely used to avoid being eaten, Some have also developed specialized weapons, which are good for things like communicating and manipulating their environment. So arthropods, or shrimp, crabs, prawns, have developed claws. They were the first invertebrate to actually develop jointed limbs, which really pushed on the evolution of invertebrates. And they can use these claws for not just predator defense, but also communicating. So we can look at very small coral crabs in table corals, things like that, which we can see, porcelain crabs, things like this. They will quite often, if you get nice and close, do something called a mural spread, which is where they'll put their claws up in the air, make themselves look scary, and give us a wave like that. And this is basically them saying, I'm angry, don't come near me. And it's a really good way that they've also used these weapons as communication tools. This also goes for things like mate acquisition and contests as well. So we'll come on to that in a later lecture, but there are also ways in which these animals use these weapons as displays and communications for animal fighting and contests. Obviously as well, they're really important, especially claws, for handling prey. So things like the harlequin shrimp are cutting small pieces of sea stars. They have very sharp claws, and they've become great ways to actually help the way that they feed and manipulate the environment to thrive. But as I said, all of these are very costly, especially those that have developed the specialized claws for communication, because often these are very large and require a lot of energy throughout their development to get these to where they need to be. And actually, these photos were all taken across the Andaman Sea in places like Richelieu Rock and Cobon, I think, one of them. But they're all things that we can definitely see. Hopefully not the box jellyfish, but yeah, they're still a great example of weaponry.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The seal-faced pufferfish, it puffs, but there's no spike.
Yeah, so that is because there's no spikes, but they still have a weapon in that both the pufferfish and the porcupine fish have a toxin called TET, which I will come on to in a minute. But the porcupine fish have the spines, which they inject if they were to be eaten. But the pufferfish can all secrete, just through their skin.
Oh.
So if they inflate, they can then secrete this toxin. But it's more of a subtle weapon.
How many times during your life they can do it?
I think it's a myth that they die after 1 or 2 times. I think they can continue, but it definitely does use up a lot of energy. So it's like stress and energy that they have to do. As with a lot of these predator defense mechanisms, if they're having to do it every day, then it's likely that they're not going to be getting the food and nutrients and stuff that they need. But yeah, they can definitely do it multiple times. Yeah. So, by far probably the most common and most recognizable, but also the best form of predator avoidance is probably this: warning colors and patterns. Individuals that have evolved this are known as aposematic, which is the scientific term for warning colors, really. And this is something that has evolved over many hundreds of thousands of years to basically communicate and display, you don't want to eat me, I am toxic. So we have a few great examples of things we can see here, we might have seen already. So the sea snake with that blackened, or sea crate, the banded sea crate with the black and white coloration. This is something that is giving off a warning pattern, very alarming to potential predators. The boxfish, yellow, very bright with black spots, again, hazardous coloration to the animals. Even more inconspicuous things that we might not assume to hold this sort of a thing is things like butterfly fish, the 8-banded butterfly fish. Although it doesn't have any toxins, it does have these dorsal spines which are actually able to be pushed up. It doesn't do them too much good when there's a shark trying to eat them, but they still have this aposematic coloration to ward off potential predators. And finally, my favourite, the crown of thorns starfish, which we have seen literally 1 or 2 of, but they're a great example of this, really brightly coloured with those spines. and those spines are very, very toxin filled, which is why we don't want to touch them. But they're also quite immune to a lot of predatory fish, bar one or two things, namely the triggerfish. The triggerfish is the top predator of the crown prawns. It doesn't seem to care about the spikes, it just gets on with it. That's why its eyes are set so far back in its head, actually, so that they don't get spiked. So, warning coloration is definitely the best adaptation. You can move around freely, wherever you want. It doesn't matter about your background. It's not energy costly at all to either move with or to develop. And you can go about your day-to-day life, mating, foraging, whatever you need to do without getting eaten. Of course, there are predators that have evolved to overcome these toxins and these things that they hold in the body, but on the whole, this is a really, really good method.
So there is co-operative, say, organic toxic, but they are not like the boxfish.
The boxfish does still have toxins. It's something called a tetradontiform. So triggerfish, pufferfish, porcupine fish, a few other things. Oh, and they all hold this TDT. It's just that they might not use them in the way that you might assume. If you were to hold a boxfish, nothing's going to happen. But if you were to eat it, then different story potentially. They store it. Even the triggerfish inside that trigger have an amount of TDT. So these tetradontiforms all hold. So just as well, I will talk about this a little bit in communication, but it's a really good point. You might assume, like, well, okay, if I just need to evolve colours to avoid being eaten, why don't animals just cheat and lie and say, I've got, look at me, I'm bright, I have no colours. And the reason for that is it's something called Zahavi's principle. Don't worry, I'll come on to it in another lecture. But basically, this is saying that evolution of these type of very selected traits will never develop without there being a true consequence. So if a fish is evolving a colour by just cheating and lying, at some point that fish will get unlucky and be eaten. And the predator will realise, oh, that's fine, I can eat you. And then it will be something that is learned out through evolution. So it cannot actually occur. So over a big period of time, actually having warning colours is pretty much dependent on having the toxin. There are obviously mimics within the animal kingdom which mimic other things, but often these guys aren't toxic. They're just trying to fill the same niche as the plant. So coming into why patterns are actually really useful, we have our friend the butterfly fish and then a very nice inconspicuous damselfish on the left. And if you were to look at these, you might say, well, both are really bright, both are very colourful, iridescent. There's lots of greens and blues in the damsel, and there's just sort of yellow, white, and black in the butterfly fish. So why are these patterns useful? Well, it's because they're predators, sharks, and some of the larger trophic predators, so snappers. They have something called hydrodynamic vision, which basically means they don't see the same spectrum of light that we do. They see largely in black and white. So to the predator, this coloration stands out a lot more than this one on the left. So the butterfly fish will be protected potentially from predators because they're still giving off this pattern, this warning pattern, despite their coloration being invalid really for protection. Whereas the damselfish, unfortunately, is going to get eaten. A combination of colour and pattern is of course best because not all fish have this lack of field colour vision. Some can see full colour, so it is definitely worthwhile having both colours and patterns. So just to finally cap off as well, the aposematic individuals with the very, very bright coloration and patterns, they often do actually combine these patterns with weapons themselves. So it's something that can come together. And this is with TDT, as I've said. It stands for tetrodotoxin, and it is something that was found in originally pufferfish and porcupine fish, but is now been found in all tetradontiforms. So things like the trigger, the porcupine fish, the filefish, all these relatives all have this TDT. And it's a very, very powerful toxin. It's a neurotoxin which basically just causes rapid cell death and paralysis. So it's really, really strong as a defense mechanism, because over this period of time, animals learn, like, I definitely don't want to eat that. And these animals have also developed the aposematic coloration to display this potential threat. So we don't get the blue ring octopus out here, but it's sort of the most famous example of TDT. And just on a side note as well, it just shows how important the ocean is for new discoveries. TDT, although being really, really deadly in the animal kingdom, has actually been used more and more in medical purposes, and it's shown efficacy in reducing like a pain-related cancer treatment, heroin withdrawal, and even treating migraines. So it's something that we're still making discoveries about the ocean, and it might be the most mundane fish that actually is going to one day be really, really big leap forward in science. If you put it in water, it will. I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm not sure, but all I know is that it's very powerful, and you want to avoid touching these guys for sure.
Do you have any theories on how animals who would ordinarily prey on these creatures, how would they know not to eat them? Say you're a small little fish,
yeah.
You see something, and how would you know?
So it would probably be something that's called a learned association process over a period of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So a fish that shouldn't be eaten, or something, it's not nice to be eaten, there will have been individuals that made that mistake many, many times, and it's something that has been has evolved to be learned within not just a species but a whole community. So a lot of the animal world, even on land, now over a period of evolution of making these mistakes, survival of the fittest, they know that warning colours instinctively are something you should not eat and you should avoid. There's probably more complex sort of dynamics in that, but probably the most straightforward explanation. So a few takeaway points. There are many forms of predator avoidance, but almost all of them have drawbacks. However, a coloration or a combination of coloration, warning patterns, and weaponry is probably the most effective way of avoiding predation. And we can look out for camouflage on all of our dives, and mimicry as well, actually. Blackwater dives offer a great example of the difference in early stage of life, like post-larval, to adult life, how these weapons and predator avoidance mechanisms have evolved to their environment. We can also look out on the reef in the day for these sponges, the yellow, the pink sponges, a great place to look for the small frogfish, which everyone wants to see, especially the photographers. And yeah, there's loads and loads of examples of camouflage on the reef, so we'll keep our eyes out for that. Thank you guys for listening.
If you like this video, click here to see more like it. Please follow us on social media and feel free to like and share.